Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left Captain Nemo and his crew, they had penetrated the southern ice barrier that surrounds the South Pole and were hoping, in the last few moments of sunlight before the months-long winter without day, to determine their exact position, and, hopefully, therefore, to find whether they had discovered and been the first of all people to reach the South Pole. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. In the few fleeting moments of the last day of the year, they were able to take an accurate reading, and indeed, Captain Nemo was able to plant his flag and claim the pole for himself and his crew. And that is where we pick up today with chapter 39, Accident or Incident. At 6 o'clock in the morning of the next day, March the 22nd, preparations for departure were begun. The last glimmer of twilight was melting into the night. The cold was sharp. The stars were shining with surprising intensity. Straight overhead, I could make out the marvelous Southern Cross, that polar star of Antarctic regions. The thermometer marked 9 degrees above zero, and when the wind came up, it was very biting. Ice was forming on the open water, and the sea started to congeal everywhere. Obviously, this southern basin was frozen over for 6 months of the year, during which time it was absolutely inaccessible. What did the whales do then? Undoubtedly, they went out under the ice barrier in search of open water. As for seals and walruses, they were accustomed to the extremely cold climate, and they stayed in this frozen waste. Out of instinct, they make holes in the ice field and keep them always open. This is where they come to breathe. And when the birds migrate north to escape the cold, these marine mammals remain sole masters of the Antarctic continent. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's tanks had been filled, and it slowly sank beneath the surface. When it reached a depth of 1,000 feet, it stopped. Its propeller began churning the water, and it headed straight north at a speed of 15 knots. That afternoon, it was already cruising beneath the immense shell of the great ice barrier. The panels in the lounge had been closed in case the Nautilus should strike submerged ice. I therefore spent the day putting my notes in order. My mind was completely occupied with thoughts of the South Pole. We had reached that inaccessible point with no more fatigue or danger than if we had been travelling in a train. And now we were beginning the return journey? Would it bring new surprises? I had no doubts, for there seemed to be no end to the wonders of underwater life. Nevertheless, since fate had brought us on board this ship 5.5 months ago, we had covered 14,000 leagues, and on this trip, which was longer than the circumference of the earth, how many fascinating or terrifying incidents had held us spellbound. The hunting expedition in the forests of Crespo Island, running aground in Torres Strait, the coral graveyard, the pearl fisheries of Ceylon, the Arabian Tunnel, the volcano of Santorin Island, the treasure in Vigo Bay, Atlantis, the South Pole. During the night, all these memories passed by, one after another in my dreams, and did not allow my brain to rest for an instant. At 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a violent blow. I sat up in bed and tried to hear what was going on, but suddenly I was hurled out into the middle of the room. Obviously, the Nautilus had collided with something, and then heeled over at a sharp angle. Feeling my way along the walls, I dragged myself along the gangways to the lounge, where the ceiling lights were still on. The furniture had been knocked over. Luckily, the showcases were well attached to the floor and had, therefore, remained upright. The pictures on the starboard side of the room were flat against the wall, while those on the port side were leaning out with their lower edges a foot away from the wall. The Nautilus was heeled over to starboard and, moreover, completely immobile. Inside, I could hear the sound of footsteps and a confused murmur of voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. Just as I was about to leave the lounge, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What happened?" I asked them at once. "That's just what we came to ask, monsieur," replied Conseil.
"Confound it," cried the Canadian. "I can tell you what happened. The Nautilus ran aground, and judging by the way it's heeled over, I don't think we're going to get away as easily as we did in Torres Strait."
"But are we at least on the surface?" I asked.
"I don't know,"
replied Conseil. "It's easy to find out," I answered. I looked at the pressure gauge. To my great astonishment, it indicated a depth of 1,180 feet. "What's all this about?" I cried.
"We'll have to ask Captain Nemo,"
said Conseil.
"Where is he?"
asked Ned Land. "Follow me," I said to my 2 companions. We left the lounge. There was no one in the library, no one either at the central companionway or in the crew's quarters. I supposed that Captain Nemo was in the helmsman's compartment. The best thing to do was to wait. All 3 of us returned to the lounge. I will pass over the Canadian's recriminations. I can't say his anger was unjustified. But in any case, I let him get rid of his ill humor without answering. We remained like this for 20 minutes, listening for the slightest noise inside the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He seemed not to see us. His face, usually so impassive, showed signs of uneasiness. He silently checked the compass and the pressure gauge, and then went over to a map of the world and put his finger on the Antarctic seas. I did not want to interrupt him. However, when he turned toward me several minutes later, I asked him, using a phrase he had employed in Torres Strait, "Merely an incident, Captain?"
"No, monsieur," he replied. "This time it is an accident."
"Is it serious?"
"Perhaps."
"Is there any immediate danger?"
"No."
"Has the Nautilus run aground?"
"Yes."
"How did it happen?"
"By a trick of nature, not through the incompetence of men. We did not make a single mistake in our maneuvers. Nevertheless, one cannot prevent the laws of equilibrium from taking effect. One can resist the laws of man, but not those of nature."
Captain Nemo had chosen an odd moment to start philosophizing, and moreover, his answer told me nothing. "Could you please tell me, Captain, what caused this accident?"
"An enormous block of ice, as big as a mountain, has turned over," he replied. "When icebergs become eaten away underneath by warm water or by repeated blows, their center of gravity rises. Then the whole mass of ice turns upside down. This is what has happened. One of these icebergs turned and struck the Nautilus as it was cruising underwater. The iceberg then slipped under its hull and lifted it with an irresistible force into shallow water, where it is now lying, heeled over on its side."
"But can't you free the Nautilus merely by emptying its reservoirs and thereby returning it to an upright position?"
"That is what we're trying to do now, monsieur. You can hear the pumps working. Look at the pressure gauge. It shows the Nautilus is rising, but unfortunately, the block of ice is rising with it, and until some obstacle stops its upward movement, our position will not change."
And, in fact, the Nautilus was still lying on its side. Undoubtedly it would straighten up when the block of ice stopped turning. But who was to say that at that moment we wouldn't collide against the underside of the barrier, and thus be horribly squashed between two surfaces of ice? I thought over all these consequences of our situation. Captain Nemo did not take his eyes off the pressure gauge. Since it was first struck by the iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it was still heeling over at the same angle. Suddenly, I could feel the hull make a slight movement. Evidently the Nautilus was righting itself a bit. The objects hanging in the lounge began to go back to their normal positions, and the walls became more vertical. None of us said a word. With beating hearts, we watched the ship right itself. The floor became horizontal beneath our feet. 10 minutes went by. "We're upright at last," I cried.
"Yes," said Captain Nemo, as he headed for the door of the lounge.
"Do you think we'll get free?" I asked.
"Certainly," he replied, "since the reservoirs are not yet empty."
The captain left, and I soon saw that at his orders the upward course of the Nautilus had been stopped. We were, in fact, close to striking the underside of the ice barrier, and it was better to remain free in the water.
"Well, we got out of that one,"
said Conseil. "Yes, we could have easily been squashed between two blocks of ice, or at least imprisoned. And then, without any way of renewing our air supply. Yes, we're well out of that one.
Presuming it's all over,
murmured Ned Land. I did not want to start a useless argument with the Canadian, and I therefore did not reply. Moreover, just then the panels opened, and light poured in from outside. We were suspended in the water, but 30 feet away, on each side of the Nautilus, rose a shining wall of ice. Above and below there was the same wall. Above, because the underside of the ice barrier formed an immense ceiling. Below, because the overturned iceberg had slid so as to come to rest on the two side walls. The Nautilus was imprisoned in a veritable tunnel of ice about 60 feet across and filled with calm water. It was, therefore, easy to get out by going either forward or backward, and then to set out again, several hundred yards deeper, on a free passage under the ice barrier. Even though the lights in the lounge had been put out, it was brilliantly illuminated by the walls of ice acting as powerful reflectors for the light on top of the submarine. I could not possibly describe the effect of its rays on these huge blocks, cut into such strange shapes. Every one of their angles, ridges, and facets gave off a different hue. It was a dazzling mine of precious stones, and especially of sapphires and emeralds, flashing their blue and green rays in all directions. Here and there one could see soft, milky opal nuances running among fiery, diamond-like points of light, shining with such brilliance that one could hardly look at them. The power of the Nautilus was multiplied 100 times, like that of a lamp passing through the lenses of a beacon.
"Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful,"
exclaimed Conseil. Yes, I said. It's a marvelous sight. Don't you think so, Ned?
Yes, confound it, he retorted. It's magnificent, even though it makes me furious to have to admit it. I've never seen anything like it, but this sight could cost us our necks. And to be frank, I feel as if we're looking at things God didn't intend for the eyes of man.
Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly, a cry from Conseil made me turn around. "What is it?" I asked.
"Close your eyes, monsieur. Don't look."
And with this, he clapped his hands over his eyes. "Oh, what's wrong, my boy?"
"I've been blinded."
Involuntarily, I looked out of the window, but my eyes could not stand the blazing light entering the room. I then realized what had happened. The Nautilus had gotten underway and was now traveling at high speed. All the quiet luster from the walls of ice had changed into flashing streaks. The fire from these myriads of diamonds had blended together. The Nautilus, propelled by its powerful engines, was traveling through a sheath of lightning. Then the panels in the lounge closed. We held our hands over our eyes and saw nothing but spots, as if we had been looking at the sun too long. It took our troubled eyes some time to calm down. Finally, we took away our hands.
"Goodness me, I never would have believed such a thing was possible,"
said Conseil.
And as for me, I still don't believe it, retorted the Canadian.
"When we get back on land,"
said Conseil,
"after seeing such wonders of nature, What will we think of those miserable continents and the tiny things produced by the hand of man? No, civilization is no longer worthy of us.
Such words, in the mouth of an impassive Belgian, showed to what a point our enthusiasm had ridden. But the Canadian made sure to throw cold water on our excitement.
Civilization, he said, shaking his head. Don't worry, Conseil. You'll never see it again, anyhow.
It was then 5 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly, I felt the Nautilus collide with something ahead. I realized its spur had just been struck onto a block of ice. It was undoubtedly due to some error in judgment, for this underwater tunnel was full of ice and not easy to navigate. I thought that Captain Nemo would merely alter his course slightly, go around the obstacle, and continue on his way. I felt sure our forward progress would not be completely blocked. Nevertheless, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus started to move backward.
Are we going backward?
Asked Conseil. Yes, I answered. The tunnel is probably blocked at this end.
Then what are we going to do?
Oh, it's simple, I said. We'll retrace our steps and leave by the southern end. That's all. In saying this, I wanted to seem more sure of myself than I really was. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's backward speed had increased, and we were now traveling very fast.
It'll take longer this way,
said Ned. Several hours one way or the other, what difference does it make, as long as we get out?
Yes,
repeated Ned Land.
as long as we get out.
After a while, I left the lounge and went into the library. My companions remained seated without saying a word. I stretched out on a couch, took up a book, and let my eyes scan the pages mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Monsieur Conseil came up and said,
"Is that an interesting book Monsieur is reading?"
"Very interesting," I replied.
"Undoubtedly, Monsieur is reading Monsieur's book."
My own book. And to be sure, I was holding my work on the great ocean depths. I hadn't even realized it. I closed the book and started walking about. Ned and Conseil got up to go to their room. "Stay here, my friends," I said, holding them back. "Let's stay together until we're out of this blind alley."
"As Monsieur wishes."
Several hours went by. Again and again, I checked the instruments hanging on the wall of the lounge. The pressure gauge showed that the Nautilus was staying at a depth of 1,000 feet. The compass indicated that it was still heading south, and the log showed that it was traveling at 20 knots, a speed which seemed excessive in such a narrow space. But Captain Nemo knew that he could not really go too fast, for in such a situation, every minute was worth a century. At 8:25, a second collision took place. This time, it was behind. I grew pale. My companions came over. I took Conseil's hand. We looked questioningly at one another, our looks betraying our thoughts better than any words. Just then, the captain entered the lounge. I went over to him and asked, "Is our route also barred to the south?" "Yes, monsieur."
As the iceberg turned over, it closed off every opening.
Then we're completely hemmed in.
Yes.
Chapter 40. Lack of air. Thus around, above, and below the Nautilus, there was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were prisoners of the great ice barrier. The Canadian struck the table with his powerful fist. Conseil was silent. I looked at the captain. His face had once again taken on its usual impassivity. He had crossed his arms. He was thinking. The Nautilus no longer moved. The captain then started speaking.
"Gentlemen," he said, in a calm voice, "there are two ways of dying under such conditions as these."
This strange person had the look of a mathematics professor explaining something to his pupils.
"The first," he went on, "is to be crushed to death. The second is to die asphyxiated. There's no question of dying of hunger, for the provisions on the Nautilus will last longer than we will. So let's think about our chances of being crushed or asphyxiated."
"As for asphyxiation, Captain," I answered, "we have nothing to fear, for the reservoirs are full."
"Right," said Captain Nemo, "but they only contain enough air for 2 days. We've now been underwater for 36 hours, and already the air inside the Nautilus needs to be renewed. Within 48 hours, our reserves will be used up."
"Well then, Captain, let's get out within 48 hours.
"We'll at the least try, by cutting through the wall around us."
"On which side?"
"Soundings will tell us that. I am going to let the Nautilus down on the lower surface, and my men will put on their diving suits and start to work on the ice wherever it's thinnest."
"Could the panels in the lounge be opened?"
"I can see no objection. We're no longer moving."
With this, Captain Nemo left. Soon I could tell by a whistling noise that the reservoirs were being filled with water. The Nautilus slowly sank and came to rest on the ice at a depth of 1,150 feet. "My friends," I said, "our situation is serious, but I am counting on your courage and energy."
"Monsieur," replied the Canadian, "at a time like this I will forget all my complaints. I'm ready to do anything for the general safety."
"Good, Ned," I said, stretching out my hand to him.
"And what's more," he continued, "I'm as handy with a pickaxe as I am with a harpoon, and if I can help the captain in any way, I hope he'll let me know."
"He won't refuse your help. Come, Ned." I led him to the room where the men from the Nautilus were putting on their diving suits. I told the captain about Ned's proposal, and he accepted. The Canadian put on his diving suit, and soon he was ready to go with the others. Each of them carried their tanks filled with a large supply of pure air. As for the Ruhmkorff lamps, they were unnecessary in the midst of waters so brilliantly illuminated by the ship's light. As soon as Ned Land was dressed, I went back to the lounge, where I found the panels open. I took up my post next to Conseil and examined the ice that surrounded and supported the Nautilus. Several moments later, we saw a dozen men from the crew step out onto the ice, and among them Ned Land, easily recognizable by his height. Captain Nemo was also among them. Before beginning to dig, he had to find out the best direction in which to work. Long soundings were therefore sunk into the side walls, but after 50 feet they found nothing but more and more ice. There was no use attacking the surface overhead, for this was the ice barrier itself, more than 1,300 feet thick. Captain Nemo then had the ice underneath sounded. He found that only 30 feet separated us from the water below. It was, therefore, a matter of cutting out a piece equal in area to the waterline of the Nautilus. About 230,000 cubic feet of ice had to be removed in order to make a hole big enough for us to pass down through. They set to work at once, and carried on with indefatigable energy. Instead of digging around the Nautilus, which would have involved great difficulties, Captain Nemo had an immense trench drawn on the ice 25 feet off the starboard side of the submarine. Then his men started chipping away along its edges. Soon the picks were beginning to take effect, and large blocks of ice were loosened. An odd effect was produced by these blocks, which, since they were lighter than water, floated up to the ceiling of the tunnel, and this ceiling, therefore, got thicker by as much as was removed underneath. But this made little difference, as long as the wall beneath also got thinner by the same amount. After 2 hours of hard work, Ned Land came back, exhausted. His companions and he were replaced by fresh workers, including Conseil and myself. The first mate acted as our foreman. The water seemed especially cold, but I soon got warm handling the pickaxe. I could move freely, even though I was undergoing a pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I returned after 2 hours to get some nourishment and rest, I noticed a big difference between the air from our diving tanks and that inside the Nautilus, which was already full of carbon dioxide. The air in the submarine had not been renewed in 48 hours, and it now contained scarcely any life-giving substances. After working for 12 hours, we had only removed a 3-foot layer of ice from the trench, or in other words, about 20,000 cubic feet. Assuming that we could continue working at this rate, we would still need 5 nights and 4 days to finish. 5 nights and 4 days, I said to my companions, when we have only 2 days' air supply in the reservoirs.
Without taking into account, said Ned, that once we're out of this darned prison, we'll still be under the ice barrier, without any way of renewing our air supply.
This was indeed true. Who could possibly calculate the minimum time required for us to get out? Might we not be asphyxiated before the Nautilus could surface? Was it destined to perish in this tomb of ice, along with all those on board? The situation seemed terrible, but everyone faced it squarely and decided to do their duty to the end. As I had predicted, a new slice, 1 yard thick, was removed from the pit during the night. But the next morning, when I put on my diving suit and went out into the water, whose temperature was between 18 degrees and 20 degrees, I noticed that the side walls of the tunnel were getting closer together. The water farther from the pit, since it was not warmed by the men working, showed a tendency to freeze. Faced with this new danger, what would now happen to our chances of escaping? How would we prevent the water from turning to ice and therefore cracking open the Nautilus's hull as if it were made of glass. I did not mention this new danger to my two companions. What good would it have been to risk their becoming apathetic and giving up the rescue work? But when I came back on board, I did mention this new danger to Captain Nemo. "I know," he said, in that same calm voice he maintained no matter how terrible the situation. "It's one more danger for us, but I don't see any way to stop it. Our only chance is to dig faster than the water freezes. We have to get there first. That's all." Get there first. But by then, I should have become accustomed to his ways of thinking. That day I wielded the pickaxe for several hours with great determination. This work kept up my spirits. Moreover, this way one could leave the Nautilus and breathe the pure air taken from the reservoirs and stored in the tanks on our backs. It was the only way to escape the foul, thin air inside the submarine. By that afternoon, the pit had been dug yet a yard deeper, but when I came back on board, I was nearly asphyxiated by the carbon dioxide saturating the air inside the boat. Oh, if only there had been some chemical process by which we could have gotten rid of this terrible, harmful gas. For there was no lack of oxygen. The water around us contained a considerable quantity which could have been extracted by our powerful batteries, thus giving us all we needed. I had thought of it, but it was no use, since the carbon dioxide produced by our breathing had already invaded every part of the ship. In order to absorb it, we would have filled the receptacles with potassium lye and to shake them continually. But we had none of this chemical on board, and there was nothing else which would serve the same purpose. That afternoon, Captain Nemo had to open some of the spigots on his reservoirs and let a bit of pure air into the Nautilus. If he had not done so, we would have never awakened from our sleep. On the next day, March the 26th, I once again took up my miner's work, starting in on the 5th yard-thick layer. The ice on either side and overhead was becoming visibly thicker. It was obvious that it would come together before the Nautilus could get free. For a moment, I fell into despair. My pickaxe almost dropped from my hands. What good was it to dig when I was going to die crushed by this water turning to rock, a death worse than any dreamed of by savages? It seems as if I were between the huge jaws of some monster, and they were closing, slowly and irresistibly. Just then, Captain Nemo, who was not only directing the work but also working himself, passed by near me. I tapped him on the shoulder and pointed to the walls of our prison. The starboard wall alone had advanced at least 12 feet toward the Nautilus's hull. The captain understood and motioned for me to follow him. We went back on board. We took off our diving suits and went into the lounge. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said, "we're going to have to take some heroic measures if we don't want to be sealed up inside this ice as if it were a block of cement." "Yes," I said, "but what can we do?" He said, "If only my Nautilus was strong enough to withstand this pressure without being crushed." "How would that help us?" I asked, not understanding what he was driving at. "Don't you see?" he went on. that then the fact that the water is freezing would help us? Don't you realize that this solidification would break open the ice field around us, just as it does the hardest of rocks? Don't you understand how it would save us, instead of destroying us? Yes, perhaps, Captain. But however strong the Nautilus may be, it could not withstand such a pressure as that, and it would merely be flattened out into an iron leaf.
I know, monsieur. We must therefore not count on nature helping us, but on our own ingenuity. We have to stop this freezing. Not only are the side walls coming in closer, but there are only 10 feet left fore and aft of the Nautilus. The ice is moving in on us from all sides.
How much longer will the air in the reservoirs permit us to breathe on board? I asked. The captain looked at me, straight in the face.
The day after tomorrow, he said, the reservoirs will be empty.
A cold sweat came over me. But why should his answer have surprised me? The Nautilus had gone beneath the surface of the open water around the South Pole on March the 22nd, and now it was the 26th. For 5 days we had been living off the air supply on board, and what was left of the good air had to be saved for the men working. As I write these lines, the impression of how I then felt is still so strong that an involuntary terror comes over my whole being, and I once again feel as if there were not enough air for my lungs. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo, silent and immobile as always, was lost in thought. Suddenly, an idea seemed to cross his mind, but he apparently rejected it. Then finally some words escaped from his lips.
"Boiling water," he murmured.
"Boiling water?" I cried.
"Yes, monsieur. We're enclosed within a relatively small space. Wouldn't jets of boiling water, constantly pumped out from the Nautilus, raise the temperature around us and retard the freezing?"
"It's our only chance," I said.
"Let's go then, Professor."
The thermometer showed the outside water to be at 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Nemo led me to the kitchen, where vast distilling machines were operating, furnishing drinking water by means of evaporation. They were filled, and all the heat the batteries could produce was thrown into the coils passing through the liquid. Within several minutes the water was boiling. It was then led off toward the pumps and at the same time replaced with more water. The heat developed by the electric coil was such that the cold water from the sea had only to pass once through the mechanism in order to arrive boiling at the pumps. It began to be injected into the surrounding water, and 3 hours later the outside temperature had risen to 21 degrees. This was a gain of 2 degrees. Several hours after this, the thermometer registered 25 degrees. "It's going to work," I said to the captain, after following this operation closely.
"I think so," he replied. "At least we won't be crushed to death. Now we only have to worry about being asphyxiated."
During the night, the temperature of the surrounding water rose to 30 degrees. That was as high as it would go. But, since sea water will only freeze at 28.4 degrees, I at least felt reassured against this danger. By the next day, March the 27th, 20 feet of ice had been removed from the trench. Only 13 feet remained to be chipped out. But this would still take 48 hours of work. We could no longer renew the air inside the Nautilus, During the day, it became worse and worse. A terrible weariness came over me. Toward 3 in the afternoon, this feeling had increased to the point of becoming unbearable. I yawned so much I felt my jaws would come apart. I began to pant as the fuel needed for breathing became scarcer and scarcer. I became completely lethargic. I stretched out, feeling weak and almost unconscious. My good Conseil, even though he had the same symptoms as I and suffered quite as much, did not leave my side. He would take my hand, encourage me, and I could hear him murmur, "If only I could stop breathing in order to leave more air for Monsieur." It brought tears to my eyes to hear him talk like this. The more intolerable life became inside the submarine, the more joyfully we would put on our diving suits to take our turns working. Our pickaxes resounded against the ice. Our arms were exhausted and our hands chafed. But what difference did it make? Life-giving air was reaching our lungs. We were breathing. Oh, we were breathing. Yet no one prolonged his underwater work beyond the time allotted. Once his job was over, each man would give a gasping companion the tank, which would pour life into his body. Captain Nemo set the example, and was the first to submit himself to this severe discipline. When the time came, he would give his apparatus to another man, and calmly enter the foul atmosphere on board, without flinching or murmuring. That day, the work was carried on with even more vigor. Only 6 feet remained to be removed. Only 6 feet separated us from open water. But the reservoirs were nearly empty of air. The little that remained had to be saved for the men working, not one atom for the Nautilus. When I went back on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I couldn't possibly describe it. Such suffering can't be put into words. The next day, I found it difficult to breathe. Not only did I have a headache, but I felt as dizzy as if I were drunk. My companions had the same symptoms. Some members of the crew were close to death. That day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo felt that our work with the pickaxes was going too slowly, and he decided to try crushing the layer of ice, separating us from open water. He had retained all his coolness and energy. His moral strength dominated his physical sufferings. He could still think, plan, and act. At an order from him, the submarine was raised off the ice on which it had been resting, and hauled over till it was directly above the huge trench we had dug out. Water was let into its reservoirs, and it sank down into the trench. Then all the crew came back on board, and the double door communicating with the outside was closed. At that moment the Nautilus was resting on a layer of ice which was less than a yard thick, and had been pierced by soundings in hundreds of places. The spigots of the reservoirs were then opened wide, and 3,500 cubic feet of water rushed in, increasing the Nautilus's weight by 220,000 pounds. We waited and listened. Hope made us forget our sufferings. Our lives depended on this one last stroke of fortune. In spite of the buzzing inside my head, I soon heard something trembling beneath the Nautilus. The ship started to go down. The ice broke with a strange noise like that of paper tearing. And the Nautilus continued sinking. "We're going through," Conseil murmured in my ear. I couldn't answer, but merely grasped his hand. Suddenly, carried down by its terrific excess weight, the Nautilus sank as if it were made of lead, or that is to say, as if there were no more ice under it. Then all the available electric power was put behind the pumps, and the water began to be dispelled from the reservoirs. After several minutes we stopped sinking. Soon, in fact, the pressure gauge showed that we were rising. The propeller, turning at top speed, made the hull quiver to its very bolts and started us on our northward course. But how long would it be before we reached the other side of the ice barrier and could surface in open water? Another day? I would be dead before then. I was half stretched out on a sofa in the library and felt as if I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, and my mind incapable of functioning. I could no longer see or hear anything. All idea of time had left me. I could not even contract my muscles. How many hours passed by like this, I cannot say, but I felt I could last no longer. I was near death. Had we surfaced? Suddenly I regained consciousness. A few breaths of fresh air entered my lungs. Had we reached the other side of the ice barrier? No. It was my worthy companions, Ned and Conseil, sparing themselves to save me. Several molecules of air had remained in the bottom of one of the diving apparatuses. Instead of breathing it themselves, they had preserved it for me, and while they suffocated, they poured life into me, drop by drop. I wanted to push the apparatus away, but they were holding my hands, and for a few moments I indulged in the pleasure of breathing. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It must have been March the 28th. The Nautilus was traveling at the terrifying speed of 40 knots. It writhed in the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he succumbed? Had his companions died with him? At that moment, the pressure gauge indicated that we were only 20 feet below the surface. A thin ice field separated us from the atmosphere. Could we break through it? Perhaps. In any case, the Nautilus was going to try. I could feel it take an oblique position, lowering its stern and raising its prow. Then, impelled forward by its powerful engines, it attacked the ice field from underneath like a formidable battering ram. It broke the ice a little bit at a time, repeatedly going back down and then striking again at full speed. Finally, it made a supreme effort and rushed up at the layer of ice, crushing it beneath its weight. The hatch was opened. One might say torn open, and pure air came flooding into the whole interior of the Nautilus. And that, my friends, on that breathless moment, is where we will leave our story for today. Thank you so much for joining me today on Soft Stories for that harrowing adventure. It reminds me a bit of one of the Tintin stories, a series of Belgian comics made in the 20th century by a fantastic writer and artist named Hergé, or his pen name was Hergé. And there is a book in which the characters are able to go to the moon, to be the first people to reach there. And on the return journey, they begin to run out of air and experience many of the same problems that Conseil, Ned Land, and the Professor go through in this portion of the story. I wonder now whether Hergé was inspired by the experiences of the Nautilus in writing Explorers on the Moon. That would be interesting. Forgive my musings and my recollections of childhood favorites. Thank you again for joining me. I must leave you now, but until next we meet, I wish you all the best, easy breathing, and goodbye.